The soft clink of ceramic on wood filled the kitchen as Carlos placed his coffee cup down. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, but he barely noticed it. His eyes flicked from the newspaper to Sophie, who sat across from him, her fingers lazily scrolling through her phone. She was wearing the same robe she always did, her hair tied up in a loose bun, the picture of domestic calm. But something was off. Any plans today? Carlos asked, his voice casual, almost forced. He took another sip of coffee, hoping to steady the unease that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Sophie didn't look up from her phone immediately, her thumbs still sliding up and down the screen. Then, with a practiced smile, she raised her head. Not much. Just lunch with the girls later. You know, the usual girl stuff? Carlos nodded, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The answer sounded routine, but her tone lacked the enthusiasm she once had when talking about her friends. He had always trusted her before, but now that trust was strained. He had nothing concrete to go on, just a feeling, one that had started creeping in months ago. Sophie glanced back at her phone, tapping away at something. For a moment, Carlos thought he caught a glimpse of a grin, but it disappeared before he could be sure. What about you? Sophie's voice broke into his thoughts, but it was casual, almost indifferent. That business trip of yours, she added, her tone light. You leave tonight, right? Gone all weekend? Carlos studied her for a second before responding. The business trip had been on the calendar for weeks, but Sophie's sudden interest in the details felt odd. He set down his coffee cup, leaning back in his chair, as if the weight of his thoughts had pushed him deeper into the seat. Yeah, he said slowly. I'll be out of town until Sunday. A lot of meetings. You know how it is? He kept his voice even, but inside, he was searching her face, looking for some kind of tell, something that would give away what had been bothering him. Was she relieved he'd be gone? Excited? He couldn't quite tell, but the idea was beginning to take shape in his mind. Sophie's eyes lit up, but only for a moment, and Carlos noticed. I'll miss you, she said, her smile wide and sweet. She leaned over the table, giving his hand a quick squeeze. Call me when you can? Okay. Carlos forced a smile, returning the gesture. Of course. But deep down, he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. He glanced down at his watch. The business trip didn't start for hours, but he had plans of his own now. His heart felt heavy in his chest, a knot of unease tightening as the morning wore on. Sophie rose from the table, heading toward the sink. Carlos watched her as she moved, the ease in her step, the lightness in her posture. She didn't seem like a woman weighed down by guilt or remorse. If she was hiding something, she was doing it well. His mind flashed back to the first few years of their marriage, how carefree and loving they had been. But that had changed over time. He couldn't pinpoint when exactly, but it was like a slow erosion, gradual and silent, until the foundation was too weak to hold anything up anymore. Lunch with the girls, huh? Carlos said, breaking the silence. Yeah, Sophie replied, washing her coffee cup. We're going to that new bistro downtown. Carol's been raving about their salads. Carlos raised an eyebrow. Carol. Of course, it was Carol. He couldn't remember the last time he'd actually seen Carol, but Sophie brought her up often enough that it was as if she were a ghost haunting their conversations. He nodded absent-mindedly, though something about this whole story didn't sit right with him. Sophie wiped her hands on a dish towel and turned around, her smile still firmly in place. You should pack soon, she said, leaning against the counter. Don't want to be late for your flight. Carlos stood up, folding his newspaper in half. He hadn't read a word. Yeah, I guess you're right, he said. His voice was steady, but inside his suspicions were growing. He moved toward her, placing his hands on her shoulders. She leaned into him, her face tilted upward, waiting for a kiss. He kissed her lightly, but his mind was far from the tenderness of the moment. Something was wrong. He could feel it deep in his bones. Sophie's smile, her relaxed demeanor, the way she seemed to glide through the morning, all of it felt too perfect, too practiced. As if she had rehearsed this routine over and over, perfecting the role she was playing. I'll pack now, Carlos said, pulling away. I've got a long weekend ahead. Sophie's smile didn't falter. Safe travels, she said. I'll see you when you get back. Carlos nodded and headed upstairs to their bedroom. Once inside, he closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his heart pounding. He walked over to his suitcase, sitting half-packed on the bed, and began to fold his clothes mechanically, his thoughts elsewhere. As he moved around the room, a plan began to form. He couldn't just leave for this trip without knowing what was really going on. The uncertainty was eating at him, gnawing at his sanity. He needed to know if his suspicions were just in his head, or if Sophie really was hiding something from him. Something big. Carlos walked over to the window, peering out at the quiet street. He'd pretend to leave, pack his bags, say goodbye, but he wouldn't be going anywhere. Not yet. He'd stay close, maybe park the car a few blocks away. He could watch the house, see if anyone showed up while he was supposedly out of town. His hands tightened around the curtains, pulling them shut. He had no proof, no evidence to justify this plan, just a gut feeling. But it was enough for him to act. The business trip would have to wait. He spent the next few hours preparing, packing his suitcase, going through the motions, playing the part of the oblivious husband. Sophie came upstairs, humming to herself as she walked into the bedroom. Carlos glanced at her as she moved toward the closet, pulling out a dress to wear for lunch. She seemed so calm, so untroubled. But then again, so had she when she smiled that morning. "Don't forget to bring back a souvenir from the trip," Sophie teased, holding the dress up to her body, checking her reflection in the mirror. Carlos chuckled lightly, but it felt forced. "I'll see what I can do," he said, closing his suitcase. "You'll be okay here alone, right?" Sophie turned, her smile bright. "Of course. I'll probably just watch some movies tonight after lunch. Relax a bit. Remember, our 15th wedding anniversary is coming." Carlos gave her a long look, searching her face for any sign of guilt. But there was nothing. If she was hiding something, she was doing it well. He zipped up his suitcase and placed it by the door. "Of course, sweetie," he said, walking toward her. "All right, I'll head out soon." Sophie wrapped her arms around his neck, leaning in for one last kiss before he supposedly left for the weekend. Her lips lingered on his, and for a moment, Carlos wondered if he was overthinking it all. But as they pulled apart, the doubt came rushing back. "I'll miss you," she said again, her eyes soft. Carlos smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll miss you too." Carlos stood at the foot of the bed, methodically folding the last of his clothes into his suitcase. The hum of the air conditioner filled the room, providing a soothing backdrop to his spiraling thoughts. He had managed to shake off most of his suspicions earlier in the day, telling himself he was being paranoid. Maybe Sophie really was just going to lunch with the girls. Maybe everything was fine, and it was all in his head. He closed the suitcase with a soft click and looked around the room. His trip was only supposed to be a couple of days, and he was planning to come back Sunday night. Sophie had seemed perfectly normal this morning, no hints of guilt, no strange behavior other than the subtle shift he had noticed recently. But even that could have been his own imagination. Satisfied with his packing, Carlos turned to head downstairs. That's when he heard her voice. Soft at first, like she didn't want anyone to overhear. He paused mid-step, his body going still, ears pricking up. Sophie's voice carried from the hallway. Hushed, but clear enough. "He's gone for the weekend," she whispered. Carlos's stomach tightened immediately. Who was she talking to? He inched closer to the door, his footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. He positioned himself just outside the bedroom, barely breathing as he strained to hear the rest of the conversation. "You can come over for a wild night," Sophie continued, her voice growing more excited. "I can't wait to taste your Carlos son." Carlos froze. His heart pounded loudly in his chest, each beat feeling like a hammer. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just heard. He pressed his back against the wall, gripping the doorframe for support. His whole body felt like it was on the verge of collapsing under the weight of the realization. Sophie giggled softly, a sound that had once made him smile, but now made him sick to his stomach. "That fucking loser will never know," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "He's so clueless." The words were a punch to the gut. Carlos's hands curled into fists as he tried to suppress the surge of anger that threatened to overwhelm him. Every instinct told him to storm in, to demand answers, to scream at her for betraying him. But he didn't. Not yet. He stepped away from the door quietly, retreating down the hallway, his heart still racing. He couldn't confront her now. It wouldn't do any good. Sophie would deny it, twist the situation, make him feel like the crazy one. No, if he was going to do this, he needed to be smart. He needed a plan. Carlos moved into the living room, his mind working at a frantic pace. He dropped onto the couch, hands shaking as he tried to think. She had made it clear she was expecting her lover to come over tonight, thinking he would be away on his business trip. The thought of them together in their home, in the bed they shared, made Carlos's blood boil. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting him from his thoughts. He picked it up and stared at the screen for a moment. It was a text from his colleague, asking if he was ready for the weekend's meetings. Carlos hesitated before responding. He typed out a brief reply, saying something had come up and he wouldn't be able to make the trip after all. Carlos stood up, pacing the living room as his mind worked through the details. If Sophie thought he was gone, he could use it to his advantage. He'd stay close by, maybe park down the street or somewhere she wouldn't expect. He could wait, watch, and gather the evidence he needed. He would make sure she had no way of wriggling out of this. He needed to see it with his own eyes, painful as it would be. He wouldn't let her lie her way out of it this time. The house was quiet, too quiet, as Carlos moved through the motions of getting ready to leave. He lugged his suitcase to the front door, making enough noise for Sophie to hear from the other room. He was careful not to let his face betray any of the anger or hurt brewing inside him. Sophie came down the stairs a few minutes later, her phone tucked into her pocket, a serene smile on her face. "Heading out soon?" she asked, walking into the kitchen and pouring herself a glass of water. "Yeah," Carlos replied, his voice surprisingly steady. "Just about to load up the car." She didn't look nervous. There wasn't a hint of guilt or concern on her face. If anything, she seemed almost relaxed, happy even. Carlos's stomach churned as he watched her move around the kitchen, oblivious to the fact that he knew her secret. "Drive safe, okay?" Sophie said, leaning up to kiss him on the cheek. "I'll miss you." Carlos gave a tight smile, fighting the urge to pull away. "I'll miss you too," he lied, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. She kissed him again, the way she always did before he left for a trip. Only this time, it felt like a mockery. He grabbed his keys, slung his bag over his shoulder, and walked out the front door, pausing on the porch to glance back at her. Sophie waved, her smile still in place as she watched him go. Carlos forced a wave in return before heading to the car. As he backed out of the driveway, he couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. Sophie stood in the doorway, watching him leave with that same innocent smile on her face, completely unaware that her whole world was about to come crashing down. Carlos drove down the street, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as his mind raced. He pulled over a few blocks away, out of sight from their house. Parking under a large tree, he turned off the engine and exhaled slowly. Now came the waiting. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. Carlos's leg bounced nervously as he sat there, staring at the clock, watching the seconds tick away. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was Sophie. "Safe travels, babe. Love you," her text read. The sheer audacity of it made Carlos want to scream. He didn't respond. Instead, he set his phone aside and stared out the window, waiting for the inevitable. His mind wandered back to their earlier years, the time when he truly believed they were happy. He had loved her with everything he had, trusted her implicitly. And now, that trust had been shattered. His jaw tightened as he remembered her voice on the phone, the way she had laughed and called him a loser, the way she had gushed over her lover. She was playing him for a fool, but not for much longer. An hour passed, then another. Finally, as dusk began to settle over the neighborhood, Carlos saw a car pull up in front of the house. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched a man step out, tall and confident, walking up to the front door like he belonged there. Sophie opened the door almost immediately, her face lighting up as she greeted him. Carlos clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. They embraced in the doorway, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. She kissed him, long and deep, before pulling him inside, closing the door behind them. Carlos felt a cold wave of fury wash over him. The evidence was right there, in front of him. His suspicions had been correct all along. He sat there in the darkened car, his mind racing, formulating the next steps. He had seen enough. Confronting them now would be too easy, too simple. No, they needed to feel the weight of their actions. They needed to suffer, just like he had suffered. Carlos sat in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared into the darkened street. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of rage and cold calculation swirling inside him. He could still see Sophie in his mind, how she had smiled and kissed him goodbye like it was any other day, like nothing was wrong, like she wasn't about to betray him again. That image gnawed at him, fueling the fire that burned deep in his gut. 15 years. 15 years of shared dreams, plans, and promises. He had given her everything, his loyalty, his trust, his love. And this was how she repaid him? Carlos shook his head, staring down the empty street. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not this time. Not without consequences. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching out like an eternity as he waited, parked just a few blocks away from the house. It had been hours since he'd kissed Sophie goodbye, and darkness had settled over the neighborhood. The glow of streetlights illuminated the quiet suburban street, but Carlos felt anything but peaceful. His phone buzzed next to him. He glanced at the screen. A message from Sophie. "I hope your trip goes well. Miss you already. Love you." Carlos read the words, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth hurt. Miss you already, what a joke. She had her lover on the way, and here she was, playing the part of the doting wife. He ignored the message, tossing the phone into the passenger seat. There was nothing left to say. Tonight would give him all the answers he needed. As the hours ticked by, Carlos leaned forward in his seat, peering down the street. He had to time everything perfectly. He needed to stay out of sight, but close enough to catch them in the act. And then, just after 10 p.m., a pair of headlights pierced the darkness. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb in front of the house. Carlos's pulse quickened as he watched the driver's side door open. Out stepped a man, tall, broad-shouldered, well-dressed. He had the look of someone who was used to getting what he wanted, someone who didn't have to worry about consequences. Carlos's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms as he watched the man casually walk up the driveway, a smug grin plastered across his face. The front door opened, and there was Sophie, her face lighting up as she greeted him. She didn't hesitate, didn't even look around to see if anyone was watching. She threw her arms around him, pulling him into a deep, passionate kiss right there on the porch. Carlos felt a sickening knot twist in his stomach. His suspicions were confirmed, and it was worse than he had imagined. This wasn't just an affair, it was a full-blown betrayal, right in front of his eyes. He watched them disappear inside the house, the door clicking shut behind them. Carlos exhaled slowly, his breath shaky. He didn't move. Instead, he reached into his glove compartment, pulling out a small black device. Weeks ago, when his gut had first told him something was wrong, he had installed a camera outside the living room window, hidden among the ivy. He hadn't wanted to believe he'd need it, but now it was his lifeline. With the press of a button, the live feed appeared on his phone. The image was clear, Sophie and her lover standing in the living room, laughing together. They moved toward the couch, glasses of wine in their hands, oblivious to the fact that they were being watched. Carlos's hands trembled as he zoomed in, capturing every detail. The way Sophie looked at this man, the way she smiled and touched his arm, like she had never smiled at Carlos in years. He snapped a photo, the click of the camera app feeling like a trigger pull. This wasn't just about catching her in the act. It was about collecting evidence. He needed proof, not just for himself, but for what came next. As the camera feed continued to roll, Carlos watched them get more comfortable. They sat close together, her head resting on the man's shoulder. They whispered to each other, their faces inches apart, their hands roaming. Carlos felt the bile rise in his throat. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He needed to see this through, no matter how much it tore him apart. A few more clicks, more photos. Each one was another nail in the coffin. Carlos's breath came out in short, angry bursts, but he forced himself to stay calm. Bursting into the house now would be too easy, too impulsive. They wouldn't see it coming. He wanted them to feel the weight of what they'd done, to see their lives unravel the way his had. The feed on his phone flickered as they made their way toward the stairs, hand in hand. Carlos knew where they were headed. The bedroom. His bedroom. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut, but he steadied himself. This was part of the plan. He watched them go up the stairs, their laughter fading as they disappeared from the living room. Carlos's hands moved mechanically as he continued to take screenshots, each one a piece of damning evidence. It wasn't long before the bedroom lights flicked on in the upstairs window, the shadowy figures of Sophie and her lover moving about. Carlos lowered his phone, staring up at the house. The camera couldn't capture what was happening in that room, but he didn't need to see it. He already knew. The mental image alone was enough to fuel his anger, but he forced himself to stay focused. He leaned back in the driver's seat, his breathing slowing as he gathered his thoughts. Now wasn't the time to confront them. That would be too simple, too messy. No, Carlos wanted this to be bigger, to make sure everyone knew exactly who Sophie really was. She had fooled him, her friends, her family, everyone, but not for much longer. Carlos picked up his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. He had work to do. If he played this right, Sophie's whole world would come crashing down before she even knew what hit her. He dialed a number, listening to the ring before a familiar voice answered. "Hey, Carlos. What's up?" It was his best friend, Ashton. Carlos had told him bits and pieces of his suspicions over the past few weeks, but he hadn't been ready to act on them. Until now. "I need a favor," Carlos said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it that Ashton picked up on immediately. "Everything all right?" Carlos paused, his eyes still locked on the house. "Not really. I found out the truth." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Ashton had known Carlos for years. He knew when something was serious. "What do you need?" he asked, his tone shifting from casual to concerned. Carlos exhaled slowly, the plan fully forming in his mind. "Sunday night, I'm hosting a little event at the house. I need you there." "Event?" Ashton asked, sounding confused. "What kind of event?" Carlos glanced up at the house again, the bedroom light still on. "Let's just say it's time to show everyone who Sophie really is." Ashton was quiet for a moment. Then his voice came back, low and serious. "You sure you want to go through with this?" Carlos nodded, though Ashton couldn't see it. "I'm sure." "All right," Ashton said, his voice resolute. "I'll be there." Carlos hung up the phone and leaned back in his seat, staring at the house in the distance. The stage was set. All he had to do now was wait. Sophie thought she could betray him and get away with it. But by tomorrow night, she would learn just how wrong she was. The morning of their 15th wedding anniversary dawned like any other. But for Carlos, it felt like the calm before a storm. He had spent the entire night preparing for what was about to unfold, his mind replaying the events of the previous evening over and over. While Sophie had been fast asleep after her secret rendezvous, Carlos had been wide awake, setting the pieces in motion for his revelation. By the time the afternoon rolled around, their home was filled with the sounds of family and friends arriving, the soft clinking of champagne glasses, and the hum of light conversation. Sophie, dressed in a flowing cream-colored dress, floated around the room, playing the perfect hostess. Her smile was warm, and her laugh seemed genuine. But to Carlos, it was as hollow as their marriage had become. She greeted guests, hugged her parents, and exchanged pleasantries with Carlos's family, all while basking in the glow of what she thought was a celebration of their enduring love. But Carlos knew better. He had rehearsed his next steps in his mind, playing out every detail of the confrontation that was about to come. As he stood near the back of the living room, a glass of champagne in hand, he couldn't help but scan the faces of those gathered. Sophie's parents, sitting near the fireplace, beamed with pride. His own parents were mingling with friends, unaware of the bombshell he was about to drop. Close friends and neighbors who had witnessed their marriage evolve over the years filled the space, laughing and sharing stories. Carlos clenched his jaw. All of them were oblivious to the truth. All of them were about to learn just how wrong their perceptions of his marriage had been. Sophie approached him, her eyes bright as she looped her arm through his. "Isn't this wonderful?" she asked, her voice soft. 15 years, Carlos. We've been through so much." Carlos forced a smile, swallowing the anger that threatened to rise in his throat. "Yeah," he muttered. 15 years? Sophie glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "You seem off. Everything okay?" Carlos met her gaze, his face unreadable. "Everything's fine. In fact, I have something special planned for later. You'll love it." She smiled again, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She squeezed his hand before drifting away to greet more guests, her suspicion fading as she lost herself in the excitement of the day. An hour passed, the party in full swing. Carlos had been keeping his distance, allowing Sophie to enjoy her moment, letting her believe that she was still in control. But now, the time had come. He glanced at his phone, checking the time before stepping into the center of the room. Clearing his throat, he raised his glass of champagne and called out, his voice loud and clear. "Everyone, if I could have your attention for just a moment." The conversations quieted as all eyes turned toward him. Sophie, standing near the dining room table, looked over with a bright smile, clearly expecting some sort of loving speech or toast. Carlos's heart pounded, his pulse quickening as the room fell into silence. He took a deep breath. "I just want to say a few words," he began, his voice steady but cold. 15 years of marriage is a milestone, one that most people celebrate with love, trust, and commitment. And I thought today would be a good day to reflect on what those things really mean. Sophie's smile faltered, a slight flicker of unease crossing her face. She shifted her weight, her hands nervously fiddling with the hem of her dress as she watched him. Carlos reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, feeling the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on him. He wasn't doing this for satisfaction. He was doing it for closure, for justice. "I've spent the last few months thinking a lot about our marriage," Carlos continued, locking eyes with Sophie. "About the promises we made to each other, the life we built, and the trust one believed we had." Sophie's face went pale, her smile completely gone now. She opened her mouth to speak, but Carlos didn't give her the chance. "And then I found out the truth," Carlos said, his voice sharpening. "The lies, the betrayal, the affair." Gasps echoed around the room. Sophie's mother dropped her champagne glass, the sound of shattering crystal punctuating the shock. Her father's face went from jovial to thunderstruck, his jaw tightening as he stared at his daughter. Carlos's own parents exchanged confused looks, clearly struggling to process what they were hearing. Sophie took a step forward, her face contorting with panic. "Carlos, wait," she stammered, her voice breaking. "Please, let me explain." But Carlos wasn't interested in explanations. He lifted his phone and pressed a button, and suddenly, the television in the living room flickered to life. All heads turned toward the screen, where images of Sophie and her lover from the night before began to play in a slow slideshow. There they were, Sophie and the man Carlos had seen the night before, kissing at the front door, laughing together over wine, holding each other as they made their way up the stairs to the bedroom. The final image showed them in a passionate embrace, the kind that made it clear this wasn't a one-time affair. The room was deathly silent, save for the occasional shocked gasp or whispered exclamation. Sophie's face drained of color as she stared at the images on the TV screen. Each click of the camera from the night before was now a public display, every intimate moment between her and her lover projected for everyone to see. She stumbled back, her hands trembling as she stared at the screen, at the undeniable proof of her infidelity. Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned to Carlos, her voice pleading. "Carlos, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen. It was a mistake, I swear." Carlos's expression remained hard, unmoved by her words. "A mistake," he echoed. "A mistake that you've been making for years, apparently. A mistake you've been lying about. Stealing from me, pretending like nothing was wrong." Sophie's parents, once so proud and happy, now stood in stunned disbelief. Her father's face had turned a shade of red, his fists clenched at his sides. "Sophie," he muttered, his voice tight with anger. "How could you?" Her mother was crying, her hand covering her mouth as she shook her head in shock. "My God, Sophie, what have you done?" Carlos took a step closer, his eyes locked on his wife. "You didn't just betray me," he said, his voice low but filled with contempt. "You betrayed everyone in this room, every person who believed in you, who believed in us." Sophie's legs seemed to give out beneath her, and she sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Carlos," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't do this. We can fix this, I swear. I'll do anything." But Carlos shook his head, his resolve unwavering. "There's nothing left to fix. You destroyed everything." The divorce papers he had prepared earlier that day, already signed and waiting in his briefcase. The room had descended into a stunned silence, the kind that felt suffocating. Family and friends, who just moments before were laughing and celebrating, now stood frozen, caught between disbelief and judgment. Her parents, sitting near the fireplace, looked shell-shocked. Carlos's parents exchanged horrified glances, their confusion turning to disgust. The guests, the neighbors, people who had seen them as the perfect couple, all had their eyes fixed on Sophie, waiting for an explanation, a justification for the betrayal. "Carlos, please." Sophie's voice cracked, trembling with desperation. "This isn't what it looks like." Her throat felt tight, panic bubbling up, threatening to choke her. Carlos stood on the other side of the room, his gaze locked on her, unflinching and cold. The warmth, the affection he used to feel for her, was gone, replaced by a calm but terrifying detachment. He set his champagne glass down slowly on the coffee table, the clink of glass breaking the heavy silence. "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like," Carlos replied, his voice sharp, cutting through the room like a knife. "You've been cheating on me for years, living a life built on lies. And it didn't stop there, did it?" Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as Carlos pulled a thick envelope from his jacket pocket. The tension in the room intensified, eyes following every movement Carlos made. Sophie stood frozen, her mind racing, but she had no idea how much worse things were about to get. "Carlos, please," she started, her voice weak as she took a step toward him. But he cut her off. "Don't," Carlos snapped, his tone brooking no argument. "Don't even try to deny it. You think this is just about the affair? About you screwing some other guy in our house while I was away working? No, Sophie, this goes much deeper." The words hit Sophie like a physical blow. Her knees felt weak, and she instinctively reached for a nearby chair to steady herself. She had expected anger, maybe a fight or a confrontation, but this cold, calculated demeanor terrified her. Carlos began pacing, his eyes never leaving her, ensuring that everyone in the room remained glued to the drama unfolding. "I've spent the last few months noticing things," Carlos continued, his voice steady, in complete control of the situation. "At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Some mischarges here and there, small discrepancies in our finances." He turned to the crowd, letting his words hang in the air. "But then, I started looking deeper." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She knew exactly where this was heading now. She had been careful, at least she thought she had, but she could see in his eyes that he had found everything. Carlos's eyes darkened as he opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of documents. "I found the bank account, Sophie. The one you've been transferring money into. Thousands of dollars over the past few years. All under a fake name. Money that should have been going toward our future, our life together." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Sophie's father rose from his seat, staring at his daughter in disbelief. "Sophie, is this true?" he asked, his voice shaking. Her mother covered her mouth, tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at Sophie with a mixture of confusion and horror. Sophie's legs wobbled, and she stumbled backward, almost losing her balance. "Carlos, no, please," she begged, her voice trembling. "I can explain." Carlos didn't flinch. He pulled out more papers, each one containing more damning evidence. "I hired a forensic accountant," he said, the words landing with a cold finality. "They traced everything, every dollar you stole, every lie you told." Sophie's mind was spinning, her thoughts crashing into each other in a chaotic mess. She tried to move toward Carlos, but her body felt like it was being weighed down by the stares of the people around her, people who had once loved and respected her. "Thousands of dollars, Sophie," Carlos continued, his tone now laced with disgust. "I wondered how you were able to afford those expensive lunches, the gifts. Turns out, you were paying for someone else's life on my dime." The shock in the room was palpable. The whispering began, growing louder, people shaking their heads in disbelief. Sophie's father dropped back into his seat, his face drained of all color. Her mother sobbed quietly, her hand shaking as she reached out toward her daughter, but unable to comprehend the scale of her betrayal. Sophie dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Carlos, please. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was going to fix it, I swear. I'll pay it all back. Every cent. Please don't do this." But Carlos wasn't swayed by her tears. He stepped forward, towering over her as she kneeled on the floor, broken and desperate. "You don't get to make promises anymore, Sophie," he said, his voice cold and hard. "You had your chance. You chose to lie, to cheat, and to steal. You thought I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't care." He pulled out another document, a legal notice this time, crisp and official. "And now," he said, handing it to her, "you're going to face the consequences." Sophie's hands trembled violently as she took the paper, her vision blurred by tears. She saw the words but couldn't process them. Legal charges, embezzlement, fraud, theft. Her heart stopped. "Carlos," she sobbed, clutching the document to her chest. "Please don't. I'll do anything. Please." But before Carlos could respond, the sound of sirens echoed through the room, the unmistakable wail of approaching police cars. Sophie's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror as the reality of the situation sank in. "I called the police, Sophie," Carlos said calmly, stepping back as two officers entered the room. "They'll take it from here." The room erupted into hushed whispers. Some guests stared in shock. Others looked away, unable to bear witness to what was happening. Sophie's parents watched helplessly as the officers approached their daughter. "No, please," Sophie screamed, trying to pull herself up from the floor, but her legs gave out again, and she collapsed. "Please don't let them take me." The officers gently but firmly lifted Sophie to her feet, reading her rights as they placed her in handcuffs. Her sobs grew louder, echoing in the now silent room. Her mother stood, reaching out toward her, but Sophie shook her head in shame. As Sophie was led out of the house, her pleas fading into the night, Carlos remained inside, standing by the window, watching as she disappeared from his life for good. The police car pulled away, and with it, the last remnants of their marriage. Weeks had passed since Sophie's arrest, and the world she once knew had crumbled into dust. She sat on the thin mattress of her jail cell, staring blankly at the gray concrete walls. The cold, sterile environment was a far cry from the comfortable life she had once lived, and the reality of her situation weighed on her like a suffocating blanket. She had lost everything: her freedom, her reputation, and most painfully, Carlos. Carlos had disappeared after the trial. Sophie had tried to reach him countless times, sending letter after letter, hoping for any sign that he might still care. Every letter was returned unopened. She tried calling his phone, but it was disconnected. The house they had shared for years had been sold, and her life outside these walls had been erased as if it had never existed. Her lover, the man she had sacrificed everything for, vanished as soon as she was arrested, leaving her to face the legal consequences alone. She couldn't even recall his last words to her. It was as if he had never been a real part of her life. The trial had been brutal. Carlos had presented the evidence, photos of the affair, bank statements that revealed her financial betrayals, and even text messages she had thought she deleted. The prosecutor had torn into her with the viciousness of a predator, and the judge showed no mercy. 2 years in prison for fraud and theft. Sophie had once been a respected woman in their community, but now she was a convicted criminal, her name disgraced. On this rare visitation day, Sophie sat in the small, dimly lit room, waiting for Carlos. For weeks, she had begged him to come, to talk to her, to give her a chance to explain. She wasn't sure why he had finally agreed, but she clung to this visit as her last hope. She needed him, needed to hear his voice, to see his face. Her heart raced with anxiety as she waited, her hands trembling as they rested on the metal table in front of her. The door to the visitation room creaked open, and Carlos stepped in. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. He looked different, calm, composed, more at peace than she had ever seen him. His posture was relaxed, his eyes clear and steady. He wore a simple jacket and jeans, nothing fancy, but he looked happy. For a brief moment, Sophie wondered if this meeting had been a mistake. "Carlos," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. She rose to her feet, but the guard's sharp look kept her from moving any closer. Slowly, she sank back into her chair, her eyes locked on Carlos, pleading with him for any sign of compassion. "I'm so sorry," she continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was stupid. I was selfish. Please, Carlos, I'll do anything. I'll pay back every cent. I just want us to try again." Carlos sat across from her, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak immediately, letting her words hang in the air between them. Sophie could feel her heart pounding, her palms sweating as she waited for him to say something, anything. "Why, Sophie?" Carlos finally asked, his voice calm but cold. "Why should I even consider forgiving you?" Sophie's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Because we had 15 years together, Carlos. 15 years. We built a life. I made a mistake. No, I made a lot of mistakes, but I love you. I do. I know I hurt you, but please, let me fix this." Carlos leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. 15 years, he repeated softly, his gaze hardening. 15 years of me trusting you, of me believing that we had something real. And the entire time, you were lying to my face. Sophie sobbed harder, her words coming out in broken gasps. "Carlos, I'll change. I'll make it right, I swear. Just don't leave me. Don't leave me alone like this. I can't do it without you." Carlos's eyes narrowed, his face remaining expressionless. "You're asking me not to leave you alone? After what you did? Sophie, you left me alone a long time ago. Every time you lied, every time you snuck behind my back, you left me." The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. She tried to speak, but no words came out. She had thought there might still be some love left between them, but as she looked into his eyes, she realized that whatever feelings Carlos had once had for her were gone. Carlos shifted in his seat, his gaze unwavering. "I gave you everything, Sophie. My trust, my love, my life. And you threw it all away." Sophie shook her head desperately, her hands gripping the edges of the table as if she could physically hold on to him. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I can fix it. I'll do whatever it takes. Just please give me a chance. I can't lose you." Carlos stood up, his decision clearly made. "It's too late for that, Sophie. You've already lost me." Sophie's heart sank as she watched him prepare to leave. She had been counting on this meeting, hoping it would be her chance to make amends, to rebuild something, anything. But now, she could see that there was nothing left for her to rebuild. Carlos looked at her one last time, his face emotionless. "I've moved on, and you need to accept that." He turned and headed for the door, his footsteps echoing in the small room. Sophie's entire body trembled as she tried one last time to reach him. "Carlos, please," she cried, her voice breaking with desperation. "Don't leave me here. Don't walk away." But Carlos didn't turn back. The door clicked shut behind him, and the cold silence of the room settled around her. Sophie sat there, her body shaking with sobs, realizing that she had truly lost everything. As Carlos walked away from the prison, he felt a sense of finality wash over him. He had spent months drowning in the anger and betrayal, but now, as he walked out of that visitation room, he felt lighter, free. Sophie's mistakes were no longer his burden to carry. He had moved on. He had found someone who valued him, someone who loved him the way he had once loved Sophie. For Sophie, however, the reality of her choices had only just begun to sink in. As the days in prison turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, she realized that the begging and pleading would never bring back the life she had destroyed. The man she had once taken for granted had walked out of her life for good, and she was left with nothing but the cold, gray walls of her cell and the memories of what she had thrown away. 3 years had passed since Carlos had walked out of Sophie's life for good. In those years, he had slowly pieced himself back together. The betrayal that had once shattered him had now become a distant memory, like an old scar that no longer hurt but served as a reminder of a life he no longer lived. Carlos had rebuilt everything: his career, his friendships, and most importantly, his sense of self-worth. He lived in a modest but beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood, far from the one he had shared with Sophie. His mornings were peaceful, filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of birds singing outside his window. His new partner, Rachel, was everything Sophie had not been: genuine, kind, and trustworthy. She had come into his life at a time when he wasn't looking for love, but had found it anyway. Carlos often thought about how different things were now. He had taken up hobbies he'd neglected during his marriage: gardening, hiking, and even painting. He and Rachel spent weekends exploring new trails or simply sitting together in their backyard, enjoying the simplicity of life. It was a contentment he hadn't known was possible. One Saturday morning, as Carlos sat at the kitchen table flipping through the newspaper, Rachel entered the room, her hair still wet from the shower. She kissed him on the cheek, then grabbed a cup of coffee and joined him. "Anything interesting today?" she asked, glancing at the headlines. Carlos shrugged. "Just the usual. Politics, business scandals, nothing new." Rachel smiled and turned her attention to her phone while Carlos continued reading. It was an ordinary day, just like any other, until Carlos's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and saw a name he hadn't expected: Ashton, his lawyer from the divorce. Carlos hesitated for a moment before picking up the call. "Ashton, it's been a while. What's up?" Ashton's voice was measured, but Carlos could sense a seriousness behind it. "Carlos, I hope this isn't a bad time. There's something you need to know about Sophie." At the mention of her name, Carlos's stomach tightened. He hadn't thought about her much lately. The divorce had been clean, and the scandal had left her life in ruins. He had moved on, leaving her behind in every possible way. "What about her?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Ashton hesitated before speaking again. "Sophie, she passed away last week." Carlos's breath caught in his throat. "Passed away?" He repeated the words, as if saying them out loud would make them more real. "What happened?" "A car accident," Ashton said. "It was sudden. I thought you should know." Carlos sat back in his chair, staring blankly at the newspaper in front of him. Sophie was gone. The woman who had once been the center of his world, who had betrayed him so deeply, was now just gone. He had spent years hating her, and now that hatred had nowhere to go. Rachel noticed the change in Carlos's demeanor and gently placed a hand on his arm. "Are you okay?" Carlos nodded slowly, though he wasn't sure how he felt. "Sophie's dead. She was in a car accident." Rachel's face softened with understanding. "I'm sorry, Carlos." He didn't say anything for a long time. Instead, his mind wandered back to the days when he had loved Sophie, when they had shared dreams and plans for the future. He had once thought they would grow old together, and even after her betrayal, a part of him had always believed she'd still be out there somewhere, living her life. Now, that part of his past was truly over. "Is there anything I need to do?" Carlos asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "Not really," Ashton said, "but there is something else you should know. Before she died, she made a will, and well, she left something for you." Carlos frowned. "What? Why would she do that?" "I'm not sure," Ashton admitted, "but she left you a letter. I can get it to you if you want." Carlos sat in silence, unsure of what to think. Why would Sophie, after everything, leave him a letter in her will? What could she possibly have to say? He almost didn't want to read it, but a part of him needed closure. One final answer to the questions that had haunted him for years. "Give me that, please," Carlos said after a long pause. Carlos received the letter. He hesitated for a moment before opening it, unsure of what he might find. Rachel was there, offering silent support as he unfolded the paper and began to read. The letter was short, written in Sophie's familiar handwriting, but her words struck him in a way he hadn't expected. "Carlos, if you're reading this, I'm gone. There are things I never said, things I should have. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I won't ask for it. But I want you to know, in the end, I realized what I had done. I saw the damage I caused, and I was ashamed. I loved you, Carlos, in my own twisted way. I didn't see it when it mattered, but you were the best thing in my life. I'm sorry it took losing everything to understand that. I wish you peace. I hope you found it. I hope you're happy. Sophie." Carlos folded the letter, his emotions a complex mix of sadness and closure. Sophie had realized, far too late, the cost of her choices. And while he couldn't forgive her, he could finally let go of the bitterness that had lingered in his heart. Rachel squeezed his hand. "Are you okay?" Carlos nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I am." As he sat there, holding the letter that would be his final connection to Sophie, he realized that he truly had rebuilt his life. The past was behind him, and for the first time, he felt free.